Baby found a German shepherd frozen in the snow. What she did next left everyone in tears. If you think love is just a word, wait till you hear what this little girl did when she found him lying there, helpless, hopeless, and nearly gone. Her next move turned a tragedy into a miracle that people still talk about today. This story will move you. Like, share, and let us know where you're listening from. It was the kind of storm that only came once every few years, fierce, relentless, and bone-deep cold. The kind of storm that made windows rattle and silence entire towns. In the small, snow-covered town of Elmridge, everything had gone still. Streetlights blinked into darkness, power lines drooped under the weight of ice, and not a single soul dared step outside unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't just a snowstorm. It was a whiteout, a blanket of fury and silence rolled into one. By morning, the roads were invisible. Trees stood like white statues, and rooftops sagged under thick snow. The town's emergency responders were already tired, running on coffee and adrenaline, braving freezing winds to check on the elderly and deliver blankets to those stranded in powerless homes. But none of them expected what they would find just outside the forest line on the edge of County Road 9. It was a search dog, Bella, who first alerted them. Her handler, Mason, followed her as she barked frantically and started digging into a snow mound just off the road. Mason dropped to his knees, brushing snow away with his gloved hands, and then he froze. There, buried under at least a foot of snow, was the motionless body of a German shepherd. His fur was stiff with frost, patches of ice clung to his back, and his breathing was so shallow it was nearly imperceptible. Mason cursed under his breath, heart sinking. The poor dog was likely gone. But then, just beneath the shepherd's chest, he saw something that made the blood drain from his face. A hand. Tiny. Alive. Within seconds, the team was surrounding the scene, pulling away more snow, until the full picture revealed itself. A baby, no more than a year and a half old, lay curled into the crook of the dog's body. She was tucked against him like a bird in a nest. Her eyes were wide, but not frightened. Her cheeks were flushed, and steam puffed gently from her mouth. She wasn't just alive. She was warm. She was safe. No one spoke for a long moment. The only sound was the low howl of the wind, the rustling of jackets, and the soft, shuddering breaths of the dog who had just performed a miracle. Mason was the first to move, wrapping the baby in his coat and calling for backup on the radio. His voice trembled. Infant found alive. Repeat, infant found alive. We need medical now. The dog's critical. He shielded her with his body. The others helped lift the German shepherd onto a stretcher, careful not to jostle him too much. One of the medics whispered, "How did he do it?" "She should be dead." "No coat, no blanket, just him." Another responder, tears freezing on her lashes, said, "This dog, he gave everything he had." They raced both the baby and the dog back to town, sirens howling through the snow. At the hospital, the doctors were ready for trauma. Frostbite, hypothermia, shock. But baby Emily, they learned her name later, had no signs of frostbite. No injuries. No bruises. Just a faint scratch on her cheek, likely from a tree branch. She was healthy. Miraculously healthy. But the dog, he was in critical condition. Severe hypothermia, tissue damage, signs of exhaustion far beyond normal. He was, as the vet described, running on loyalty and instinct alone. No collar, no tags, just scars. One long and healed down his side, another near his eye. He had clearly lived a life full of hardship. A stray? A lost pet? A service dog left behind? No one knew. No one could explain what he was doing out in that storm. But one thing was clear. He had found that baby, wrapped himself around her, and refused to let the cold in. The town of Elmridge buzzed. The story spread faster than the storm itself. Headlines began to appear online. Stray dog shields baby from blizzard, saves her life. Guardian angel found in snow. People who had never cared about stray dogs suddenly found themselves lighting candles outside the veterinary clinic. Children drew pictures of the brave dog and taped them to the clinic windows. One elderly man donated his entire Social Security check toward the dog's treatment, saying through tears, "That baby could have been my granddaughter." But through all the noise, baby Emily remained quiet. She hadn't cried once. Not during the rescue, not in the hospital, not when the doctors poked her with needles or took her temperature. But when the nurse tried to move her from the emergency room to pediatrics, she pointed her little finger toward the dog's room. Her lip quivered. She didn't speak, but she reached. She wanted him. And when they wheeled her crib past the room where the German Shepherd lay wrapped in warming blankets and 4 lines, her small hand brushed the air toward him. The nurse paused just long enough for her fingertips to touch his fur, cold, still damp. The dog's ear twitched. She smiled. No one knew then what bond had been formed. No one could guess how their lives would become so tightly bound. But that was the moment it began. Not with a bark or a cry, but with silence, with trust, with 2 souls who had found each other in the snow. The doctors said the baby wouldn't have survived another hour out there. And the dog? He should have frozen long before dawn. But something stronger than instinct had kept him there. Something deeper than training or chance. Maybe love, maybe fate, maybe something we'll never understand. All they knew was this. When the world went quiet and the cold came crashing down, he stayed. And because he stayed, she lived. Just one day before the snow buried everything, before the headlines and candles and whispered prayers, the town of Elmridge had been its usual sleepy self. Quiet streets, low clouds, and holiday lights flickering on porches. It was Sunday evening, and the first flakes of snow had just started to drift down as little Emily Carter, bundled in her red jacket, was strapped into her car seat in the back of a modest silver sedan. Her cheeks were flushed from kisses and cookies. Her grandmother had sent her off with a full belly and a handmade woolen hat, which now sat lopsided on her head. Her parents, Grace and Tom Carter, were both tired but content. The weekend had been filled with laughter, casseroles, and stories repeated for the 100th time. Tom rubbed his eyes as he started the car, squinting into the growing snow. Grace looked over her shoulder to check on Emily, who was already dozing off with her thumb tucked under her chin. The road home from Grace's mother's cabin wound through a long stretch of woodland, scenic during the day, but treacherous when covered in black ice. And tonight, the storm was moving in faster than anyone expected. Visibility dropped quickly. The radio warned of early blizzard conditions, but by the time Tom reached the sharp bend before the county highway, it was already too late. The car hit a patch of ice. There was no screech, no warning, just a silent, stomach-dropping slide. Tom jerked the wheel instinctively, but it only made things worse. The vehicle spun, once, twice, then slammed sideways into a ditch. Metal crunched. Glass shattered, and then silence. When Grace opened her eyes, her ears were ringing. Snowflakes drifted gently through a spiderweb crack in the windshield. Her legs were pinned, her head aching. She turned her neck painfully toward the back seat. "Emily," she whispered. The seat was empty. Her heart slammed into her ribs. Panic drowned the pain. She looked again. The buckles were still latched, but the seat itself had tipped, broken loose from the force. The door on Emily's side was open. Blown open? Kicked open? She didn't know. She didn't understand. Her baby was gone. Tom was slumped in the driver's seat, unconscious. Blood trickled from his scalp. Grace screamed his name, but he didn't move. She reached for her phone, but it had been flung somewhere during the crash. She tried to unbuckle herself, to crawl out, but her leg wouldn't budge. Something was wrong. Something deep and sharp. She screamed into the storm. "Emily!" Snow fell harder. The light faded. An hour passed before a passing snowplow saw the glint of the wrecked car under the drifting white. Emergency responders rushed in, quickly pulling Tom and Grace from the wreckage. Grace was frantic, sobbing, hoarse from screaming Emily's name. "She's gone. She's not in the car. My baby's out there." At first, some thought she was disoriented from trauma. Others feared the worst. A full search was launched within 30 minutes. Helicopters were grounded due to wind. Volunteers poured in with flashlights, dogs, and snowshoes, combing every inch of forest and ditch along the road. The town hadn't seen this kind of coordinated effort since the fire at the old mill 10 years ago. But as night fell and the snow thickened, hope began to dim. No footprints were found. No trail. Just thick, undisturbed snow. It was as if Emily had simply vanished. Inside the hospital, Grace was sedated. Tom woke groggy, confused, and devastated. They clung to each other in silence, praying for a sign, praying for anything. At 3 a.m., the sheriff held a short press conference, his eyes swollen with exhaustion. "We're doing everything we can. But conditions are severe. Visibility is near zero. We ask for your prayers. And if anyone sees anything, a small red jacket, a flash of movement, call it in. Immediately." By morning, over 50 people were out searching. Many believed, though none said it aloud, that Emily wouldn't survive the day. Not in that cold. Not at that age. But deep in the woods, where the trees whispered secrets only animals could hear, something else was happening. A stray dog, large, quiet, and battered by life, was moving with purpose through the storm. His paws bled as he trudged through the snow, head low, nose working. He'd smelled smoke earlier, smelled oil, metal, something human. And now he heard something. A cry? A cough? A memory? He didn't know why he moved toward the sound. He only knew he had to. Later, people would call it a miracle. Some would say fate. Others would say it was pure coincidence. But those who understand animals know it wasn't chance. It was instinct. It was memory. It was the call of something innocent, something that needed him more than anything ever had. Emily Carter had been thrown from the vehicle on impact. Her seat had landed 10 feet from the road, half buried under snow and branches. She had woken only briefly, cried once, and then drifted into stillness. But she hadn't been alone for long. The dog found her as the storm thickened, sniffed her face, and lay beside her without hesitation. He wrapped himself around her small, trembling body. No one saw them. No one knew. But he did. And he stayed. As the storm swallowed the town, as the search parties grew desperate and the night stretched into silence, the baby girl slept, warmed not by blankets or fire, but by the slow, fading heat of a creature who had nothing but gave everything. And 24 hours later, when the world found them again, it would be too late to say thank you. But just in time to begin the story. Long before the snowstorm, before the freezing night where he became a hero, the dog known now as Max was just a shadow on the edge of town. People had seen him, a large, limping German shepherd with a deep scar over his right eye and a crooked ear. His fur was faded and patchy in places. He never barked. He never chased cars or growled at children. But still, people crossed the street when they saw him. They whispered stories. Some said he'd attacked someone years ago and escaped the pound. Others believed he was feral, dangerous. There was a boy in town who claimed Max's eyes glowed in the dark. Adults brushed it off, but they kept their distance too. He had no collar, no name, no one who claimed him. They just called him that stray, or the ghost dog. But there was a time, not too long ago, when Max had a name and someone who whispered it with pride. He had been born in a working dog facility in Kentucky, the strongest of his litter, quick learner, obedient to a fault. Max had been trained from 6 months old to serve. His early life was filled with discipline and praise, treats and targets. By 2, he was certified as a K-9 military companion, assigned to a young veteran named Staff Sergeant Adam Pierce. Adam had served 2 tours overseas and returned home with invisible wounds, panic attacks, nightmares, silence. But when he was matched with Max, something inside him softened. Max didn't ask questions. He didn't flinch when Adam woke up sweating in the middle of the night. He just sat there quietly, placing a paw on his chest until his breathing slowed. They were inseparable. Together, they went on walks, sat at lakesides, and took long drives just to escape the noise of the world. Adam would talk to Max the way others spoke to friends. Sometimes, it seemed like Max understood every word. And maybe he did. After all, dogs like him weren't just trained to respond to commands, they were trained to feel, to sense fear, anxiety, danger. They were trained to love without conditions. But peace is fragile. One day, during a routine morning jog, Adam collapsed from a massive heart attack. He was only 29. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Max had sat there beside his lifeless body for nearly 4 hours, refusing to move. When paramedics tried to separate them, he growled for the first time in his adult life. After Adam's funeral, Max was sent to live with Adam's older brother in a city apartment. But it didn't last. The brother worked 2 jobs, had no time, and didn't understand what Max needed. The barking returned. The pacing. The whines at night. Within 2 weeks, Max was driven out to the countryside to find a better place for him. That better place turned out to be the shoulder of Highway 11. And so he wandered. From one small town to another, from garbage bins to abandoned sheds. He slept beneath porches and old tractors. He learned which houses left food out for barn cats and which ones chased him with rocks. He stopped trusting people, not because he hated them, but because he didn't know how to be needed anymore. For nearly 3 years, he lived like this, in and out of sight. Some winters he barely made it through. Summers brought ticks and heat. But through it all, Max endured. Not because he was a fighter, but because, somewhere deep inside him, that old instinct still burned. Protect, serve, fit. Even if no one wanted him. Even if his world had long since gone quiet. And then came the night of the storm. He had been sheltering beneath an old wooden bridge when the wind shifted. At first, it was a sound, faint, like a whisper in the trees. Then a scent, not meat, not blood, but something softer, familiar, human. He followed it, nose low, heart racing in a way it hadn't in years. Through knee-deep snow, past broken branches, over the sharp crack of ice. The scent grew stronger. His body ached, but he moved faster, driven by something he didn't understand. And then he saw her. A small bundle, barely moving, half buried in white. Her face was pale, but her eyes were open. She looked at him. Not with fear, not with surprise, but with a kind of stillness. Max didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, sniffed her cheek, and gently lay down beside her, curling his body around her like he had once done for Adam. Like he'd been trained to do, back when he still had a purpose. The snow fell heavier. His limbs grew numb. But he didn't move. He didn't move when the wind howled. He didn't move when darkness swallowed them. He didn't move because this child, this fragile, trembling child, had no one else. And somewhere in Max's silent heart, the old voice returned. The voice of a man who once loved him, who once whispered to him in the dark. "Stay with me, boy. Just stay." So Max stayed. And in doing so, he was no longer the dog no one wanted. He became the reason a child would live. The emergency lights cut through the fading gray morning like a second sunrise, but no one watching felt any warmth. The baby had already been rushed inside the hospital, her small frame bundled in 3 layers of fleece, her cheeks pink from cold but not injury. Nurses stared in disbelief. She was perfectly healthy. Not a single bruise, no signs of frostbite, no trauma, no tears. It was as though the storm had never touched her. But all eyes weren't on Emily now. They were on the dog. The one they'd once whispered about from behind closed doors, the one they'd avoided on sidewalks, called stray, cursed, dangerous. Max was lifted from the stretcher with more care than anyone could have imagined days earlier. His limbs were stiff, his breathing shallow, body twitching in shock. The fur around his paws was blackened at the edges, frostbitten. His eyes were closed and his chest barely moved. His heartbeat registered, then dipped, then surged again. The vet, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Lena Saunders, took one look and muttered, "He's not going without a fight." She didn't know the full story yet. All she knew was that a child had been found alive in the woods, and this half-frozen animal had been wrapped around her like a living blanket. But when one of the EMTs leaned in and whispered, "He saved her life," kept her warm. No one knows how, Lena's hands trembled just slightly as she worked. Max was carried into the back surgery room, where heated pads and thermal blankets awaited. His vitals were erratic. His lungs had partially collapsed from cold-induced trauma. 2 of his toes on the left hind leg were already showing signs of tissue death. Blood tests showed severe dehydration, early-stage kidney stress, and internal bruising, likely from pressure or exposure. But he was breathing. Faintly, stubbornly, breathing. Outside, the town stirred. At first, it was just a rumor, someone saying a stray had saved a baby. Then it became a headline. By noon, every resident of Elmridge knew the story. A few hours later, it was on the state news. A headline scrolled across the bottom of TV screens in diners and waiting rooms. "Baby rescued in blizzard, protected by stray German shepherd." That afternoon, someone started a GoFundMe titled, "Help Save the Angel in Fur." The photo was blurry, taken by a paramedic of Max on the stretcher, but the image spoke louder than words. In just hours, the donations surged past $20,000. Strangers wrote comments like, "He's a hero." "That baby is alive because of him." "Give that dog the key to the city." By evening, the vet clinic's parking lot was filled with flowers, dog treats, and candles. Children drew cards with crooked hearts and the words, "Thank you, Max." The same children who used to hide behind their mothers when he walked by. Now they cried at his window. Inside, Max remained unconscious. Dr. Lena didn't leave his side. She hand-fed him a syringe of warm fluids, adjusted the thermal pads every hour, and whispered words she wasn't sure he could hear. "You did good, boy. Just hold on. She's okay. You made sure of that. Now let us take care of you." Emily, in the room down the hall, sat in her mother's lap quietly. Grace Carter hadn't stopped crying since the hospital told her Emily had no injuries. No bruises. Not even red skin from the cold. She wept again when she learned how. "He just found her?" she asked the nurse, holding her daughter tighter. "He laid on her all night?" The nurse nodded. "Didn't move an inch." Grace looked down at Emily, who held a soft hospital bear in one hand and stared at the hallway door with curious, glassy eyes. "Do you want to see the dog, sweetheart?" she whispered. Emily didn't answer, but she nodded. They wheeled her down the hall slowly, past beeping machines and sleepy-eyed volunteers. When they reached Max's room, Grace paused, unsure if this was a good idea. But Emily pointed. Her small hand lifted again. Inside the room, Max's breathing was assisted by a small nasal tube. Wires draped across his chest like tangled vines. His ears didn't perk up. His tail didn't move. Emily didn't cry. She reached toward him, slowly, carefully, and placed her hand on the side of his neck. Her fingers touched the fur, and for just a second, the monitor beside the bed let out a single beep louder than the rest. Dr. Lena smiled gently. He knows she's here. Word spread quickly. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian, a protector, a miracle. The papers called him the angel in fur. News anchors used phrases like miraculous loyalty and incredible animal instincts. But no one could really explain it. How had he found her? Why had he stayed? How had he not frozen to death himself? The town didn't have answers. But they had awe, respect, guilt, because they remembered the day animal control was called on Max for sleeping behind the gas station. They remembered the time someone threw a bottle at him from their truck. They remembered turning away. And now they stood at the clinic window, eyes wet, hearts soft, waiting for the next update on his condition. By midnight, the vet had stabilized him. The tissue on his paw would need further examination. His breathing was slow but steady. They still didn't know if he would make it through the night. But for now, he was holding on. Just like he always had. The days that followed felt like they belonged to someone else's life. A life paused between two realities, before the storm and after the rescue. In the quiet room tucked at the end of Elmridge's small veterinary clinic, Max lay curled under thick blankets, tubes running from his side, slow beeps from the monitor counting every breath he took. The world outside called him a hero, the media called him an angel, but inside this room, he was simply there, fighting silently to stay alive. In the pediatric ward just 2 hallways over, Emily Carter hadn't spoken a word since she was found. Not a cry. Not a laugh. Not even a whisper. The doctors said trauma could do that. That silence was the way some children processed fear, shock, and loss. Her mother, Grace, had tried to coax her with soft songs, her favorite storybooks, even her grandmother's cookies. Nothing worked. Emily just stared. At the window. At the wall. At nothing. Her tiny face, once full of wonder, seemed lost in a fog of memories no child should ever have. But every time they walked past the vet clinic room, just to get fresh air, just to move her legs, Emily's gaze shifted. Not toward the people. Not toward the flowers or blinking machines. Toward the door. His door. Grace noticed it on the second day. Emily would stop walking. Her fingers would curl into her mother's sweater, and she'd lean slightly, just enough to make Grace turn her head. "You want to see him again?" Grace had asked gently. Emily didn't answer. She just looked at the door with those wide, unreadable eyes. So Grace pushed it open. Max hadn't moved much in 48 hours. The vet team had done everything they could, warm compresses, light sedation, fluid therapy. But the trauma he'd endured was beyond physical. His body had given all it could, and now it was just waiting. Emily stood at the foot of the bed. For a long time, she didn't move. Her little hands rested at her sides. Then slowly, without anyone guiding her, she stepped forward and reached out, her fingers barely brushing the edge of the blanket where Max's paw rested, exposed and still wrapped in gauze. The moment her hand touched him, Max moved. It wasn't much, just a twitch, a faint flexing of the paw, a shift of muscle under skin. But it was enough. Enough to make the nurse gasp. Enough to make Grace, who had been holding her breath for days, let out a trembling sob. Emily didn't flinch. She slid her hand fully onto Max's paw and stood there, eyes fixed on his closed face. Her thumb rubbed the side of his leg, a motion so gentle it was almost instinctive. Max didn't open his eyes, but his ear flicked. His chest rose, slow and steady. And in that sterile room full of wires and fear, something unseen moved between them. A connection. The bond. Grace knelt beside her daughter, trying to keep her emotions quiet. "Sweetheart, that's so good," she whispered. "He knows you're here." Emily didn't reply. But for the first time in days, she looked at her mother. Not through her. Not past her. At her. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't loud. But it was real. In the days that followed, Emily asked, with gestures and tiny footsteps, to visit Max again. The nurses began to expect her. They'd tidy his room just a little more before she arrived. They'd smile when she entered. Sometimes she would hum. No tune in particular. Just a soft, breathy melody, as if trying to comfort the big, silent dog who had once been her shield in the snow. One afternoon, Grace walked in to find Emily sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Max's bed, flipping slowly through a picture book. She wasn't reading aloud, but she pointed at the pictures, then at Max, as if telling him what each one meant. When Max let out a low exhale, not a growl, not a whimper, just a soft breath that almost sounded like a sigh, Emily reached up and stroked his head. That night, Max's vitals improved for the first time. The vet, Dr. Lena, called it remarkable. But she didn't try to explain it. Some things didn't need explaining. The town, still buzzing from the rescue, now had a second miracle to follow. People asked about Max's progress in grocery store lines, at church services, even on the school intercom. But most of all, they asked about the girl, the quiet one, the baby who hadn't frozen in the snow, the baby who hadn't spoken since the accident, and now, the baby who smiled when she touched a dog. Grace started to believe that healing, like love, didn't always need words. One morning, as they walked the familiar hallway toward Max's room, Emily paused at the window just before the door. She looked at her reflection, then pointed, not at herself, but at the collar resting beside Max's bed. "Ma," she said. Grace froze. It was barely a whisper, the softest syllable, a half-formed word, but it was there. "Ma." Emily pointed again, then stepped into the room and reached for Max's paw. She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to, because in that moment, with her fingers wrapped around his, and her eyes locked onto his sleeping face, the bond between them wasn't just forming, it was already there. Unspoken. Unbreakable. In a town like Elmridge, people talked. About the weather, about their neighbors, about which diner made the best biscuits. But after the storm, after the rescue, and after the photo of a frost-covered German Shepherd curled around a living baby went viral, the town talked about something else. They talked about Max. He wasn't that stray dog anymore. He was the hero, the guardian, the dog who gave every ounce of warmth to keep a child alive. Headlines called him the miracle shepherd, and for once, the town didn't roll its eyes at the exaggeration. If anything, it felt too small a title for what he had done. Outside the vet clinic, flowers and stuffed animals gathered at the window where Max lay. Someone taped handwritten cards to the glass. "Thank you for saving our baby. You are love. We owe you everything." There were candles that flickered through the night, and even a little wooden sign that read, "Not all angels have wings." Donations poured in from everywhere, not just from Elmridge, but from neighboring towns, then across the state. Within a week, the GoFundMe for Max's medical bills passed $50,000. Dr. Lena, the vet who had been by Max's side from the beginning, wept when she saw it. "We can give him more than care now," she said. "We can give him comfort, a home, a future." But it wasn't just Max the town was rallying around. It was Emily too. She had become something of a symbol. The child who survived the storm. The silent little girl who'd lost her voice, and then found it beside a dog everyone had once turned away. Her story stirred something deep in people. It reminded them of all the ways they'd failed to see what mattered, of all the quiet souls they'd ignored, both two-legged and four. Every day, Grace brought Emily to the clinic. Every day, Max seemed to stir just a little more. His tail, once still as stone, now gave soft thumps when he heard her footsteps. His eyes, once dull, would flicker open when her hand brushed his fur. She'd sit beside him, legs swinging off the edge of the chair, sometimes humming under her breath, sometimes just staring into his face like she was listening to something no one else could hear. People began timing their visits around hers. They'd leave little things: a new chew toy, a warm blanket, a tiny scarf knitted by an old woman who hadn't picked up her needles in years. One little boy left a dog-shaped balloon and whispered, "Thank you for being brave," before slipping out with his mom. Emily still didn't talk much, but she smiled now. Sometimes even laughed, a soft, airy giggle that floated through the hallway like sunlight through a crack in a door. Grace could hardly believe it. This was her daughter, the one who hadn't made a sound for days after the accident. Now, she reached for her coat when it was time to visit Max. Now, she ran ahead in the hallways. At home, Grace would hear her humming to her dolls, the same gentle tune she'd started while sitting beside Max. One night, as Grace tucked her in, Emily turned her head slightly and whispered, "He's getting better, Mama." Tears rushed to Grace's eyes. It wasn't just Max who had saved Emily. It was Emily who was helping to save Max. Back at the clinic, volunteers poured in to help care for Max. A retired carpenter offered to build him a custom orthopedic bed. A teenage girl made him a name tag that said, "Max, our hero." Someone brought in framed photos from the forest where he had been found, the trail now renamed by the town council as Guardian's Path. Dr. Lena kept a notebook on the front desk called Messages for Max. Dozens of people wrote in it every day. Some notes were funny, some poetic, others heart-wrenching. A Vietnam veteran wrote, "I've seen loyalty, but I've never seen anything like what you did. You remind me what love is." Even the mayor visited. He stood in the clinic lobby, removed his cap, and placed a medal on the counter, an honorary token from the town, usually reserved for veterans. He handed it to Dr. Lena and said, "When he wakes up, give him this. Tell him Elmridge thanks him." But Max didn't need the medal. What he needed was already there, in the soft touch of a child's hand, in the sound of her voice returning one syllable at a time, in the warmth of people who once feared him now calling his name like an old friend. One morning, as the sun broke through the frost-covered windows, Max lifted his head, fully, for the first time. Emily was already in the room. She looked up from her drawing, gasped, and ran to him, arms flung wide. She wrapped herself around his neck and whispered, "Hi, Max." And this time, he wagged his tail. Not once, not faintly, but strong, steady, alive. The bell above the clinic door gave a soft chime as it swung open that morning, just like it always did. But the man who stepped through it wasn't like the others. He wasn't holding flowers, or a donation envelope, or a phone to take pictures. He stood still for a moment just inside the entrance, clutching an old, worn-out cap in his calloused hands. His coat was faded green, military style. His eyes, though, were the part you noticed first, a mix of steel and sadness, like they'd seen too much and forgotten too little. "I heard there's a dog here," he said softly to the receptionist. "A German shepherd, bent left ear, scar above his eye." His voice was scratchy, tired, but precise. The receptionist paused, caught off guard. "You mean Max?" The man gave a slow nod. "Used to be called Sergeant Maximus," he said. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a photo, bent, creased, and decades old. A soldier, much younger, grinning in desert sand. And beside him, a dog. That dog, standing proud, chest out, gaze fixed. Dr. Lena came immediately when she heard. The man introduced himself as Carl, a retired Army veteran. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just sat down quietly, laid a folder on the desk, and began to speak, the way people do when the words have been waiting inside too long. He wasn't just a dog, Carl said. He was my partner, my shadow, my anchor. The folder was full of memories, photos, old vet documents, discharge papers. Max in uniform. Max by Carl's side in a dusty tent. Max guarding a Humvee. One picture showed Max licking Carl's face while he laughed, wearing a birthday hat in the middle of a war zone. We came home in 16. I was a mess, Carl continued. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't breathe half the time. PTSD's like that. It eats at you in silence. Max stayed. He paused then, rubbing his thumb along the edge of the photo like it might disappear. He used to sit at the foot of my bed when the nightmares hit. Wouldn't move until I calmed down. I don't think I'd have made it through that first year without him. Carl swallowed hard. But when my wife passed in 17, I started shutting down again. I stopped talking. Stopped everything. And one night, I forgot to latch the back gate. I didn't even realize he was gone until morning. He looked up now, eyes shining. I searched everywhere. Shelters. Towns. Weeks turned into months. I kept telling myself someone must have taken him in, that he was okay. But after a while, I stopped believing it. His voice dropped to a whisper. Then I saw that article. Dog saves baby in snowstorm. I saw the scar, the eyes, and I knew. Dr. Lena sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Would you like to see him? Carl didn't speak. He just nodded. She led him down the hallway toward Max's room. The room was quiet, sunlight warming the floor through the window. Max lay curled on a padded bed, eyes half closed. He was healing, but slowly, quietly, with the kind of patience only dogs seem to understand. Carl stood in the doorway for a long time. His breath caught in his chest as he stepped inside. He knelt beside Max, took off his cap, and in a voice barely louder than the hum of machines, said one word. Maximus. Max's ear twitched. Then his eyes opened. They didn't widen. They didn't blink. They just found Carl's face and locked on. Recognition, deep, slow, almost spiritual, passed between them. Max lifted his head slightly. His tail gave one small wag. Carl let out a breath he'd been holding for 6 years. He reached forward and rested a trembling hand against Max's shoulder. You came back, he said, voice cracking. You came back to save someone else. Of course you did. Then, finally, Carl broke. Quiet tears fell down his cheeks as he bowed his head beside the dog. You were more than a dog. You were my last connection to life. And I let you go. Max shifted just enough to press his nose into Carl's wrist. Neither of them said another word. They didn't have to. Later that afternoon, Emily arrived for her usual visit. She walked through the door, humming softly the tune she always did, clutching a little drawing she'd made for Max. But when she saw the man kneeling beside him, she paused. She looked at Carl, then at Max, then walked slowly across the room and sat beside them both. Without saying a word, Emily reached for Carl's hand and placed it gently on Max's paw. The old soldier looked at her, stunned, and she smiled, soft, honest, knowing, as if to say, you're not alone anymore. The days that followed were slower, quieter, but in the best kind of way. The kind that allows healing to take root, not loudly, but patiently. Max lay in his bed under the window, wrapped in warmth, the sun catching the tips of his ears in the morning light. He no longer needed the machines to breathe for him. His lungs were weak but steady. His tail moved more now, small, thudding taps whenever someone he loved entered the room. Carl visited often. Not every day, but enough that Max no longer flinched at his voice. He brought liver treats and old photos and talked to Max in the same voice soldiers use when they're finally safe. But it was Emily who kept the room alive. Her presence was no longer silent. She'd come in with her picture books, dragging her crayon bag, placing pages beside Max like he was part of the story. She mimicked him too. When Max lay with his head resting between his front paws, Emily would copy him. When he tilted his head at the sound of a voice, so would she. She'd rest her chin on the side of his bed, blinking at him like she expected him to answer all her unspoken questions. The clinic staff started calling it mirror healing. Not official, not clinical, just something they'd never quite seen before. One afternoon, Dr. Lena came into the room holding a set of charts and a guarded look on her face. She crouched beside Max, gently stroking his left hind leg, the one that had gone stiff and cold after the frostbite. The tissues were improving, but barely. She looked up at Carl and Grace, who had joined Emily that day. "We're still fighting for the leg," she said, "but we may have to let it go." Carl nodded slowly, rubbing Max's ear. "He's already done more on 4 legs than most of us do with 2. He'll be fine." But Grace saw something different, something more painful, in Emily's eyes. The word amputate landed like a thunderclap in her small, silent world. She didn't fully understand it, maybe, but she understood enough. Max was her friend, her protector, and now he was the one who needed saving. That evening, Emily took her crayons and drew Max with one leg wrapped in a bandage, smiling, tail wagging, standing proudly beside a stick-figure girl with brown scribbled hair. On the paper, she wrote one single letter, a shaky, oversized The next morning, Max began physical therapy. It wasn't easy. His muscles had weakened from disuse. The frostbite had done real damage. The process was gentle, slow, and painful. But Max endured. Step by trembling step, he began to rise again. Emily was always there, sitting cross-legged with her doll in her lap, watching with wide, determined eyes. She clapped when Max took 2 steps. She hummed her soft tune when he wobbled. And when he finally stood without support for the first time, she whispered something no one had heard from her lips since before the crash. "Ma." Everyone froze. Grace dropped the book she was holding. Dr. Lena's pen stopped mid-chart. Emily blinked, then looked at Max. "Ma," she said again, this time louder. "Ma." Her mother covered her mouth with both hands, tears springing instantly. "She said his name," she whispered. "Oh my God." She said his name. Max, of course, didn't understand what the humans were saying. But he saw Emily's face. He heard the shift in her tone. He wagged his tail and inched forward, nudging her hand with his nose. Emily laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. And that moment, that tiny, imperfect syllable, became the turning point. Ma turned into Max. Max turned into Mama. Mama turned into Hi. And soon, Emily was humming and naming colors and pointing to things and giggling without fear. Like her silence had just needed one dog's footsteps to give her permission to return. The town watched from a distance, stunned. This wasn't just a dog healing. This wasn't just a girl recovering. It was 2 broken souls building each other back piece by piece. The vet clinic had never felt like this before. Volunteers stayed late. Staff brought extra blankets. Donations didn't slow down. In fact, they increased. People were calling it a love story. Not the romantic kind, the pure kind. The kind you feel in your chest when no one's watching. Carl took to sitting outside with Max in the sun when weather allowed. He'd talk to him like he used to, about the news, the weather, his bad knees, his regrets. Max listened, always listening, like nothing in the world was more important. And Emily? She didn't even need to talk to Max anymore to be understood. She would just look at him. He would blink. She'd nod. That was enough. The paperwork didn't take long. The decision did. Dr. Lena had sat across from Grace and Tom Carter that afternoon, the file open on her lap, her fingers folded tight. She had gone over everything slowly, carefully: Max's age, his injury, the frostbite damage to his hind leg that may never fully heal. He's not going to be the kind of dog that runs after balls or climbs stairs, she'd said gently. He might need medication for the rest of his life. And vet checkups. And patience. Grace had listened without interruption. Tom, quiet as always, had one hand resting on his wife's knee. But it was the little voice from the seat beside them that broke the silence. Max, come home. Emily. Her words were still few, still halting, still sometimes wrapped in hesitation. But this time, they came out with the clarity of certainty. She wasn't asking a question. Not really. She was telling them what her heart already knew. Max was coming home. That night, the vet clinic sent him off with a new collar, a box of medications, a thank you card signed by the entire staff, and more tears than most patients ever received. Volunteers came out to wave. Even Carl was there, standing near the curb with a single yellow rose tucked behind his ear, an old soldier's joke that only Max would understand. As they lifted Max into the back seat of the Carter family's SUV, Emily clapped softly. She'd already spread out a small blanket beside her booster seat, where she planned for Max to lay. Grace looked over and smiled. Sweetheart, he might want to lie down in the trunk area. No, Emily said firmly, her hand already resting on Max's paw. Here. Max didn't fight it. He let his body slump beside her, resting his head against her knee, tail gently tapping once, twice. The drive home was quiet. Not heavy, not awkward, peaceful. Like something broken had been mended, stitched back together by soft hands and second chances. The house looked different when they pulled into the driveway. It wasn't the paint or the porch lights or the frozen garden bed still waiting for spring. It was something invisible, a sense of warmth that hadn't existed since before the accident. Since before that snowy night when Emily disappeared and came back with more than anyone had expected. Grace helped Max out first, guiding him with a soft, "Come on, boy," and steady hands under his ribs. His steps were slow but purposeful. He limped a little, but his eyes were alert. Emily followed close behind, carrying his new food bowl with both arms like it was made of glass. Inside, they had already set everything up, a large orthopedic dog bed in the corner of the living room next to the fireplace. A box of toys, most secondhand, some brand new. A handmade nameplate, Max, home at last. He sniffed it all, walked in a slow circle, then lowered himself onto the bed with a deep, grateful sigh. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just let his head fall to his paws, and for the first time in a long time, he rested like he belonged. Later that evening, Tom sat beside Grace on the couch while Emily lay curled up next to Max on the rug. Her head rested against his side, her tiny fingers buried in his fur. The TV was on, but no one was really watching. The fire popped softly, casting warm light against the walls. Tom looked over at Max, then at his daughter. His voice came low and quiet. "He saved her," he said. "Now it's our turn to save him." Grace reached for his hand and nodded. There was no ceremony. No speeches or balloons or welcome signs. Just a dog coming home. A child choosing love. A family deciding that healing didn't always come in perfect packages. Later that night, long after Emily had been carried to bed, her arms still wrapped tight around her stuffed animal, her cheek pressed to Max's old blanket, Tom stood alone by the back window. Outside, a soft flurry of snow was falling. Not a storm, just a gentle reminder. He saw Max through the doorway, lying peacefully in the glow of the firelight, and for a brief second, Tom felt like he could breathe again. Really breathe. Like something heavy had lifted. A breath behind him. Grace stepped in and leaned against his shoulder. "I didn't know if we'd ever get her back," she said quietly. "Not really." Tom turned and looked at her. "We didn't," he replied. He did. The snow came again, almost exactly a year later. It started quietly that morning, delicate flakes drifting from a sky the color of pearl. Just like before. But this time, the air didn't feel dangerous. There was no panic, no sirens, no townspeople bracing for tragedy. The blizzard warnings went out, yes, and the news reminded people to stay off the roads, but inside the Carter household, the snow meant something entirely different now. It meant memory. It meant full circles. Emily sat at the window with her chin resting on her hand, watching the snow collect on the porch railing. She wore a cozy purple sweater, her tiny feet tucked under her, curls framing her curious eyes. Her breath left little puffs on the cold glass as she whispered to herself, counting snowflakes. All of them. Her math wasn't perfect, but her joy was. Max lay beside her, his body stretched along the floor, head resting on his front paws, ears slightly perked. He wasn't the same as he'd been a year ago. His hind legs still didn't work the way it used to. He walked slower now, and the cold made his joints ache. But his eyes, those deep, steady eyes, were alive. So peaceful. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "It's snowing again, Max. But I'm not scared this time." He didn't respond, of course, not in the way people do. But his tail tapped gently against the floor. That was all she needed. Grace stood in the kitchen, watching them from a few steps away. She smiled to herself, remembering how Emily used to shrink from the snow, cry when she saw frost on the windows, tremble at the sound of wind in the trees. For weeks after the storm, anything white made her flinch. But Max had changed that. He'd shown her the snow wasn't something to be feared, not when it came with warm hands, familiar smells, and the sound of a dog's heartbeat beside her in the night. They spent that morning just like any other, baking muffins, stacking block towers, and rereading the same 3 picture books. Emily made up stories about Max being a snow captain, leading a team of animals to rescue frozen toys. Max, as usual, accepted his new title without complaint. In the afternoon, while the wind picked up outside and the snow thickened, Emily insisted on going out into the yard, just for a few minutes, bundled in her snowsuit, holding Max's leash like she always did. Grace hesitated, but Tom said quietly, "Let her go. She wants to make a new memory." So they opened the door. The cold hit instantly, but Emily didn't shiver. She stepped out onto the porch, her boots crunching gently into the snow, Max hobbling beside her with a determination that hadn't faded with time. Together, they made their way to the edge of the yard, where the tree swings stood frozen in place. Emily turned to Max and said, "Last year, the snow tried to take me. This year, I'm taking it back." Max wagged his tail once. She scooped up a handful of snow and held it out to him. "You get to touch it first." And with a soft laugh, she placed the snowball gently on top of his paw. He looked down at it, then up at her, and then, ever so gently, he sneezed. She giggled so hard she fell backward into the snow. That night, as the blizzard rolled through the town again, covering roads and rooftops in thick layers of white, the Carter house glowed like a lighthouse in the cold. Inside, Max lay curled on his bed beside the fireplace, his body warm, his breathing calm. Emily was tucked into her blanket nearby, tracing circles on his back with her fingertip. "Mama," she said, "can Max stay with me forever?" Grace paused before answering. "As long as forever lasts, sweetheart." Emily nodded like she understood. "Then I'll be his forever too." Outside, the wind howled, not like a warning this time, but like a lullaby, distant and low. Max opened one eye, just long enough to watch the snow fall beyond the glass. He had known hunger. He had known pain. He had known what it meant to be forgotten. But now he knew warmth. He knew a child's laugh and the gentle tug of her hand. He knew what it felt like to be chosen, not because he was strong, not because he was useful, but because he was loved. The snow hadn't melted yet, but the sun had started returning to Elmridge. The kind that breaks through clouds in soft patches, turning the frost on tree branches to glitter. Birds had begun their cautious return. Inside the Carter home, winter still lingered, in muddy boots by the door, damp mittens on the radiator, and Max's steady presence near the fireplace, where the heat soothed his old joints. Emily, now older in ways beyond her years, spent most of her days with him. They still took their short walks, though now Grace always watched from the kitchen window, knowing Max couldn't go as far as he once did. His steps were slower. His ears didn't lift as high. But when Emily called, he always came. That morning, Emily had been particularly giggly. She dressed herself in mismatched socks, snow boots, and a yellow scarf that trailed behind her like a flag. "Max," she'd said, "let's go make paw prints in the snow." He followed her to the door, as he always did, leaning slightly to one side, dragging that hind leg with the determined patience only he had mastered. Grace was just setting the kettle to boil when she heard the scream. It wasn't long or loud, just a sharp, startled cry that cut through the quiet morning like shattered glass. She dropped the mug in her hand. It hit the floor and broke, unnoticed. She ran. The back stairs behind the house were wooden, slick with a thin sheet of new ice. Emily had been halfway down when her foot slipped, her tiny body thrown forward, arms flailing. And Max, old, aching Max, had moved before anyone could see it happen. He lunged. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't fast. But it was everything he had left. He pushed off with what strength remained in his hips, his front paws reaching forward, body twisting in midair just enough to put himself between Emily and the hard ground. There was a soft thud, the kind that doesn't echo, the kind that's followed by silence. When Grace reached them, Emily was curled on her side in the snow, stunned but unhurt, her mittens still clutched in one hand. Max lay just behind her. He wasn't bleeding. He wasn't trembling. He just wasn't moving. Grace dropped to her knees. "Oh God." Max. Her hands fumbled against his fur, searching for breath, for movement, for a response. His eyes were closed. Emily sat up, blinking at him, confused. "Max," she whispered. No response. She crawled toward him and pressed her hand against his chest. "Max, it's me. I'm okay." Still nothing. And then, the smallest flutter. A breath. A twitch of the tail. His eyes opened, just barely. Emily leaned close, her forehead touching his. "I'm okay," she said again. "You caught me. You did it." He blinked once. Slowly. And then closed his eyes again. Tom arrived moments later, his boots sliding across the icy path. He lifted Emily into his arms as Grace cradled Max's head. "We need to get him inside," she said, though her voice trembled as she said it. "Now." They carried him together, the same way they'd once carried him out of the vet's office a year ago, though this time he didn't resist. He didn't whimper. His body was still, limp in their arms. Only his heartbeat, faint and fluttering, said what he could not. The vet came quickly. Dr. Lena dropped everything when she heard. She moved with urgency, her hands professional, her face unreadable. She listened to his lungs, checked his spine, whispered quiet things under her breath. "He took the brunt of the fall," she finally said, "with his age and his injury history." She didn't finish the sentence. Emily sat beside him all afternoon. She didn't cry. She didn't speak much. She just held his paw, her cheek resting against the side of his leg. She whispered stories to him, made up ones. Ones where dogs never grew old, and stairs were never slippery, and snow never hurt. That night, Max remained in his bed by the fire. The house was quiet, too quiet. Grace stood by the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, watching the two of them, girl and dog, side by side in the flickering glow. Tom joined her and said, "He did it again." Grace nodded. Even now, he'd give everything for her. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But that night, they stayed by his side, just like he had always stayed by hers. The world felt quieter the next morning. The snow outside had turned to rain, soft, steady, as if even the clouds knew it was a day for mourning. The Carter home remained still, no laughter, no footsteps racing down the hall. Only the gentle hum of the fireplace and the steady tick of the old clock on the mantel filled the silence. Max had made it through the night, but just barely. Dr. Lena had come early. She didn't need to be called. She just threw. She brought her bag, a thermos of warm tea, and eyes that had seen this too many times. She knelt beside Max, gently ran her fingers down his side, and said nothing for a long while. His breathing was labored now, slow, heavy pulls of air, spaced out like he was giving each breath permission before taking it. His eyes were closed, but not from sleep. From weight. From where? Emily sat beside him, her knees tucked under her. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid that her mother had done in the dark, hands shaking, heart already grieving. She hadn't said a word all morning. Grace and Tom stood nearby. Tom's hand rested on Grace's shoulder, steadying them both. They had known, deep down, the moment it happened. The way Max fell, the stillness in his body, the silence in his eyes. They had hoped, prayed, that maybe it was just a setback, that maybe he'd surprise them again. But now, watching the rise and fall of his chest slow with each passing minute, they knew. This wasn't a setback. This was the end. Dr. Lena placed her hand gently on Max's head. "He's not in pain," she whispered. "He's just tired. Very tired." Emily reached out with small, steady hands and cupped Max's face. She leaned in until her forehead touched his, nose to nose, breath to breath. Her lips trembled, but she didn't cry. Not yet. "Max," she whispered, barely louder than a breath. His ears moved. Everyone in the room stilled. Emily closed her eyes and said, slowly, clearly, every word shaped with intention, "Thank you for finding me." Max's tail, heavy and worn, wagged once. Just once. A slow, gentle sweep across the wooden floor. A sound so soft, so fleeting, that it would have gone unnoticed in any other room. But not here. Not now. Then his chest rose. And fell. And didn't rise again. No sound came. No gasp. No cry. Just stillness. It was Grace who broke first, turning into Tom's chest with a sob that tore the quiet in half. Tom held her, eyes clenched shut, his grip firm, as if holding her together could somehow keep himself from falling apart. Dr. Lena wiped her eyes silently. She had been in this moment many times before, watched families say goodbye to old pets, faithful companions, but never like this. Never to a dog who had once been alone, forgotten, feared, and had somehow become everything. Emily stayed right where she was. Her fingers brushed Max's fur, once warm and alive, now cooling with the minutes. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stayed. Because that's what Max had always done for her. He had stayed. Through the cold. Through the storm. Through every slow step and every sleepless night. Through fear, through silence, through the quiet heartbreak of recovery. He had never left her side. And now she would not leave his. Grace eventually knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her daughter. Emily leaned into her without resistance, still holding Max's face in her hands. "He was waiting for me to say it," she whispered. "He waited until I said thank you." And maybe he had. They buried Max at the edge of the property later that week, under the big oak tree where he used to lay in the summer, watching the wind move through the leaves. Carl came and placed a folded American flag beside the marker. Local children came with letters. One brought a medal he'd won at a school race and placed it on the small stone. Emily drew a picture, Max and her, hand in paw, walking across a snowy hill, and tucked it inside a mason jar, sealed tight and buried beneath the soil. The stone simply read, "Our hero, our heart, our forever." The snow had melted by the time the town gathered. A soft spring breeze drifted through Elmridge, carrying the scent of thawed earth and early blossoms. The sky was streaked with color that evening, pinks and golds folding into the horizon like quiet applause from the heavens. At the center of the park, just beneath the large oak tree where the roots reached like ancient hands through the grass, stood a small memorial. A stone, simple and round, marked the place. Max, it read, etched in clean, bold letters. "Our hero, our heart, our forever." Below it lay a framed photo of Max, tail midwag, eyes lit with something close to joy. People began arriving just after sunset, many carrying candles, some with flowers. Some came alone, others in pairs, holding hands or arms linked, like grief and gratitude had woven them together. They stood in quiet clusters, eyes soft, footsteps careful, as if they were afraid to step too loudly near his name. Grace and Tom stood off to one side, arms around Emily, who clutched her drawing pad to her chest. She had drawn something new, a picture of Max with wings, not like an angel, but like a soldier, proud and gentle. The kind of wings that didn't soar, but guarded. Carl arrived just before the first words were spoken. He wore the same coat he'd worn the first time he visited the clinic, and in his hands he held Max's old collar, now polished, the name tag still scratched, but whole. He looked tired, but not broken. When the mayor stepped up to the small microphone placed near the base of the tree, there was no formal greeting. No pageantry. Just a breath, a glance across the faces of neighbors and strangers who had once passed by Max with suspicion. "I don't think any of us expected this," the mayor said. "To be standing here tonight, not just remembering a dog, but honoring a life that changed ours." He stepped back. Then came others. A teacher who remembered how Max used to walk near the schoolyard fence, never barking, just watching the kids. A grocery clerk who once gave Max a scrap of chicken behind the store and swore he bowed in thanks. A child who said, "He didn't scare me. He looked sad. But I think he was just looking for someone." And then Carl stepped forward. He didn't use the microphone. He just stood by the stone, voice rough, low, but steady, the kind of voice that silences a crowd without asking. "Max didn't just save Emily," he said. "He saved me twice." He held up the collar for a moment, then turned it in his hand. People used to look at Max and see scars, damage, a dog with baggage. But what they didn't see, what he never stopped showing, was loyalty, devotion, a heart bigger than most people ever dream of having. He looked around, eyes landing on each face like he wanted the words to stick. He gave more than his life. He gave us hope. He reminded us what love looks like when it doesn't ask for anything in return. Silence fell again, and for a long time, no one filled it. Then Emily stepped forward. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She walked up to the stone and placed her drawing at its base. Then she knelt, laid her hand on the earth, and whispered something only the wind heard. People began placing candles around her, one by one. Within minutes, the oak tree glowed, golden light flickering up its bark like fireflies in the night. That evening, Max's story was told not through headlines, not through viral posts or rescue reports, but through voices, real, raw, human. In the same park where dogs once barked at him, where people crossed the street to avoid him, the town now stood to remember him. Not as a stray, not even as a hero, but as one of them. Back home that night, the Carter house was quiet again. Emily slept with Max's old blanket folded at the end of her bed. Grace placed the drawing in a frame on the wall. Tom sat by the window, watching the candles flicker in the distance, still glowing like stars on the edge of town. Max was gone. But he hadn't left. Not really. Because some stories, the right ones, keep walking long after the paws that carried them are gone. The new wing of the Elmridge Public Library smelled like fresh paint and pinewood shelves. The sun poured through tall windows that hadn't yet gathered fingerprints, warming the polished floor in golden patches. Along the back wall, just above a hand-built reading nook covered in cushions, hung a sign in carved oak, "The Max Room, for Quiet Heroes." People had been arriving all morning. Parents with children, retirees with cameras, neighbors in knit sweaters and folded scarves. Some brought books to donate. Some just brought their presents. But all came for the same reason, to honor the dog who had given this town far more than anyone expected, and to hear a little girl speak his name once more. Emily sat in the front row beside her mother, legs swinging just above the floor, clutching a folded piece of lined paper in her lap. Her dress was a soft blue, her hair tucked behind her ears the way Max used to nudge it with his nose when she leaned down to whisper to him. She was 6 years old now. Still small. Still gentle. But she carried something in her, the kind of steady stillness that only comes from having loved deeply and lost deeply, too. Behind her stood a mural, a painting of Max in soft grays and browns, his eyes wise, one ear tipped just slightly to the left. He sat beneath a tree, a storybook between his paws, while children curled beside him listening. It was whimsical, yes, but something in those eyes told the truth. When the librarian introduced her, the crowd went silent. Today, a very special young lady is going to share some words. She wrote them herself, the librarian said, wiping at her glasses. And we are honored to have her speak them here, in a room named for someone who once saved her, and in many ways, saved us all. Emily stood slowly. Grace started to rise with her, but Emily gave a tiny shake of her head. "I've got it." She walked to the small podium with careful steps, her paper pressed close to her chest. When she looked up, dozens of eyes met hers. There was no fear in her, only weight. The kind a child shouldn't have to carry, but somehow does. She unfolded her paper. Her hands trembled slightly. Then she spoke. "Hi, my name is Emily Carter, and I had a dog named Max." A few soft exhales rippled through the room. He didn't come from a pet store or a Christmas present box. He came from the cold, from the woods, from the snow. And I think maybe he came from heaven too. Her voice wavered but didn't break. "I didn't talk for a long time after the accident. The doctors said I forgot how. But I didn't forget. I just didn't feel safe. Like my words were hiding." She looked up. The room was frozen, not in fear, but in reverence. Max didn't talk either. But he always knew what I needed. He didn't say, "Hello," or "I love you." But when I was scared, he'd sit closer. When I couldn't sleep, he'd rest his head on my bed. When I was shaking, he'd let me hold his paw until I stopped. She paused, took a deep breath. Max didn't speak, but he said everything I needed. That's when it happened. A crack in her voice, slight and sharp, like glass shifting under pressure. She blinked quickly, but she didn't stop. He didn't stay forever, but he stayed long enough to help me find my words, long enough to show me what love means when you don't have to earn it. A sniffle echoed near the back. Then another. She looked toward the mural. I still talk to him, sometimes. At night. Or when it rains. I tell him I miss him. That I still draw him. That I'm okay. That I'm trying to be brave the way he was. Her final line came softer, but clearer than anything before. This room has his name on it. But Max gave me mine back. She folded the paper carefully, two small hands pressing the corners down like it mattered. And then she stepped back. No applause came at first, not because people weren't moved, but because most of them couldn't speak. Grown men wiped their eyes. Mothers pulled children into their arms. Carl stood near the door, holding his hat to his chest, tears running unchecked down his weathered face. Finally, someone clapped, a slow, heartfelt clap that spread like warmth through the space. And then everyone stood, not because she was a child, not because she was brave, but because they'd all seen something in that moment, something Max had left behind. Not just in Emily, but in all of them. Years passed. The seasons turned gently, as they always do in quiet towns like Elmridge. Children grew taller. Trees leaned heavier with snow. The corner house where Max once slept beneath the fireplace stayed warm, though the paw prints near the back door had long faded with time. Emily Carter grew to, not just in height or age, but in strength, in clarity, in grace. She moved through school quietly, but never alone. Max's memory stayed with her like a shadow of comfort, not heavy, not haunting, just present. A gentle warmth pressed against her heart, reminding her who she was and who she had become. She never stopped talking after that day in the library. In fact, she talked more than anyone expected. About books, about birds, about her dreams. But most often she talked about him, about Max. The dog who had saved her. The dog who didn't need words to speak volumes. By the time Emily turned 25, she had become what some in town called a miracle with a gentle voice. She studied speech therapy, worked with children who had forgotten how to talk, or had never learned, or were too afraid to try. She sat beside them, not with textbooks and charts, but with stillness, patience, and a story. The story of a dog who had once sat beside a broken little girl and taught her how to feel safe again. She opened her first clinic on the corner of Main and Willow, a small, sunlit space with paper butterflies hanging from the ceiling and soft blankets stacked in every room. There were beanbags instead of stiff chairs, chalk walls instead of waiting benches, and a quietness in the halls that didn't feel empty, just calm. At the front door, just beside her nameplate, Emily Carter, thence C.C. Zubin, stood a small bronze statue. It was simple. No grand base, no marble pillars. Just Max, sitting the way he always had, ears perked, eyes soft, tail curled around his front paws. If you stood quietly beside it, you almost expected him to move. At its base were 7 words. He gave me my voice. The first time a parent asked her what it meant, Emily smiled, knelt beside their child, and told them the truth. He saved my words. And now I help save others. Every winter, on the first day of snow, Emily had a ritual. She'd pause whatever she was doing, walk outside onto the small patio behind her clinic, and stand beneath the falling white. She'd tilt her face to the sky, close her eyes, and smile. Sometimes she'd whisper, "Thank you." Sometimes she'd whisper, "Still here?" But most often she'd simply say, "I remember." And she did. She remembered the snow. She remembered the cold. She remembered the silence that wrapped around her for so long until it didn't. Until Max. She told his story to every child who came through her door, some with trembling hands, some with quiet tears, some who couldn't yet meet her gaze. She never made it dramatic, never made it about death or pain. She made it about courage, about how sometimes the one who finds you isn't the one who speaks first, but the one who listens deepest. And always, at the end, she'd say, "He didn't talk, but he gave me my voice." One little boy, barely 5, once placed his hand on the statue and whispered, "He's my hero now, too." Emily nodded. "Mine forever." The town never forgot him either. Each December, the library hosted a Max night in the reading room. Kids came in pajamas, held cocoa with 2 hands, and listened to Emily tell the story again, of a dog in the snow, a child in the cold, and a bond that couldn't be broken by anything, not even time. Carl passed a few winters after Max, but not before donating his last service medal to the town. It hangs in a frame beneath Max's mural. A small plaque reads, "For loyalty beyond any battlefield." The tree where Max was buried still stands. Children climb it now. Parents sit beneath it. Some don't even know the full story, but the ones who do smile just a little longer when the wind moves through the branches. Grace and Tom grew older, quietly proud, always watching their daughter with the kind of love that doesn't need to be said out loud anymore. And Emily? She just kept showing up. Every day, every season, every story. Because even though Max was gone, he hadn't really left. He lived in every child who found courage after silence. He lived in every snowflake that made her pause. And he lived in her, in the soft way she spoke, the fierce way she loved, and the steady, unshakable way she believed that even the most broken hearts can find their way home again. Life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes, connections form in ways we don't understand. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible journeys. Until next time, stay curious and keep believing.